Good morning, students, and we are very happy to be here for our session on climate security. And before we get started, I will turn it over to Randy to give a little announcement.
Well, good morning and welcome to our second day of our 2001 Youth Security Forum, the first one that's gone virtual. So it's great to have not only students live, but also record this for the future. And this is made possible by some of our members today. The Chamber of Commerce of Reno Sparks has stepped up to sponsor a panel. We also have our the Nevada National Security Site, which is MSTS company. And then we actually have had three members that really value the way we are educating, reaching out and educating students. And so Ted Morse, Larry Struve, and I think it's Norm and Jan Zymak have all donated funds today to help us keep this forum, this outreach to the youth during COVID going. So we're very grateful for our sponsors. And we look forward to having a great conversation on climate change. I'll turn it over back to you now, Maureen.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Randy. And I am thrilled to be here with Dr. Tegan Blaine from the U.S. Institute of Peace. And Dr. Blaine is also joined by Megan Chalabowski, close enough, who's also with the U.S. Institute of Peace. So she'll be able to talk about some of USIP's initiatives, educational initiatives. So with that, I'm going to start. I'm sure our students have had a chance to watch your introductory video, Dr. Blaine. So thank you very much for that. You compacted some of the major challenges in climate security down to 10 minutes, which was quite a formidable task. But now I'm going to ask you to start out with giving a little bit of background about who you are and how you got to where you are and how you even got to that beautiful setting behind you. And then we're going to jump into a discussion about climate security. Emma, you are welcome to put questions in the text box anytime or raise your hand and we'll bring you on live. So with that, Dr. Blaine.
Thank you so much. And for Emma and for the other students who are involved today, it's just really thrilling to be able to engage with all of you. I'm really looking forward to having all of your questions today. I got here through a very roundabout path, which for somebody like me who's used to planning, I had to kind of step back and decide that I was going to let my career take its own path and not try to plan everything. You know, I originally thought I was going to go into book publishing, and then I got into college and decided that I also really still loved math. I was horrible at history. I was horrible at all the social sciences. Chemistry, I absolutely hated, but I loved literature and I loved math. In the end, the math side of me won out. And I eventually went on to become a secondary school teacher in the Peace Corps in sub-Saharan Africa, and then did a PhD in climate science, which is mostly physics, quite a bit of math as well. But you know, after I finished my PhD, I was debating becoming a professor, but realized I wanted to work on problems that were relevant for humans, and particularly relevant for the developing countries where I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And so I didn't take the normal path after you finish a PhD. Instead, I moved to Washington and started working on policy, originally at the State Department, and then for a company called McKinsey Consulting, which does strategy, but at the time was doing a lot of work on climate change and international development. And then I moved from there to the US Agency for International Development, which you might have never heard of. It's a very small agency in comparison to many of the others, but it works on projects all over the world, a lot of projects around education, around healthcare, especially in poorer countries that have problems affording the services that our governments and our private sector do in the United States. But for them, I spent about a decade running a climate change program focused on Africa and supporting countries to begin adapting to climate change. But you know, after a decade, I was ready for a new challenge. And I had always been interested in peace building, but once you're tagged as a scientist, it's difficult to figure out how to make that career switch. But USIP, the Institute of Peace here in Washington, DC, advertised for somebody to help spin up a new program on basically climate change, environment, and peace building. And so I jumped at the chance, both to work at an institute that really has centered peace building in its mission, but that would challenge me intellectually and where I felt I could bring something to the table while working to spin up a program in a new area for me. In terms of the picture behind me, unluckily, it can't compete at all with Maureen's picture, which has just amazing colors in it. But I am currently situated in Switzerland. My husband is Swiss, and we came over here because our elementary school kids could attend school in person here, whereas in Washington, DC, they couldn't. And so it was a really great opportunity for them to learn more about their dad's culture and get better at speaking his language. So it's at least mountains, but not West Coast mountains from the United States.
Excellent, Dr. Blaine. Thank you so much for that. You talked quite a bit about climate security and how it has, how climate change has led to areas of conflict, how we are seeing strains of migration. As you look out for the next generation, look over the horizon as they go off to college and consider careers in the next 5 to 10 years. What do you see as the biggest problems we have on the horizon? And some ideas about what areas, what fields, what places they could be looking at to contribute to solutions to some of these vexing problems.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And there's no way to just limit it to one thing, you know. The two big issues that I am most concerned about when I think about my kids growing up in this world are how we will adapt to climate change and what we are doing to the natural world. Because the Earth is, just from a scientific standpoint, the Earth is in a very delicate balance of radiation from the sun that is reflected back into space and keeps us at the right temperature, and all of the environmental systems on which life depends. And so, you know, I have tended to come at things initially from an environmental angle, and then where those are potentially leading to human conflict, which is what is going to really impact us on a day-to-day life. But I do think that it's incredibly important to be working on these issues, both from the angle I come from, but from many other angles as well. And so, you know, some people think that scientists don't work on policy. In my opinion, absolutely not. Scientists should be working on policy and bringing their background in why things work the way they do to the policy table. And I recognize many of you are probably interested in government, which is why you're in this program, or interested in security issues. But I would urge you not to dismiss the scientific fields and how you can contribute to the world that way. That said, I do think that it's really critical to think about how environmental changes are leading to more conflict. And I really believe that we are going to see an increasing number of conflicts coming out of environmental challenges. We talked a bit about the migration issue last week, but you know, there are so many other ways that climate change intersects with people's lives. Climate change is impacting the amount of food that's available to people. It's impacting the amount of water available to people. It's changing health systems and public health issues. And all of these things are so complex. And when people's lives are made up of water, of food, of health, then you can see how climate change is going to impact not just decisions about migration, but day-to-day decisions about how communities get along that are just as relevant for the United States as they are for any other region of the world. You know, we depend, especially in the West, which is so dry, we depend upon snowpack in the mountains. We depend on water coming from hundreds or even thousands of miles away to feed many of the cities and many of the agricultural areas in the United States. And so thinking about what that means as those resources change for farming communities, for providing water for cities, you can begin to imagine how conflicts will emerge, whether that's, you know, conflicts over the Nile Basin, or whether that is conflicts around water on the West Coast of the United States. And so I do think that it's really important to be working on policy issues proactively, to be working on conflict resolution issues proactively, to be coming in as a scientist and providing guidance on these issues, even to be working as an engineer who can develop new technological solutions. All of those careers are going to be important in the future.
Excellent, Dr. Blaine. Thank you for that explanation. Emma, since you're here with us, do you have a specific question for Dr. Blaine? Okay, so you mentioned in the video a breach of the social contract in regards to fragility. How do we improve governments around the world to deal with these problems directly? You got the rock star student here. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Emma, for such an important question. I may need to think for a few seconds about that. You know, that is a really tough one. We have seen in the United States how the social contract has been violated even in our own country at times and around different issues. And the social contract in some way is, you know, it builds on increasing trust. It takes two partners willing to set something aside, whether it's citizens in a government or whether it's individuals within a community, to work on very small trust building steps and eventually to increase that trust. And so in the United States, it took a government that over decades built investments in education, built investments in healthcare, built investments in the social safety net or in roads or things like that, that got us to the point where we assume that the government will perform certain functions. And we put the trust in the government. We pay taxes, we go to vote because we believe that the government will deliver on that. That's very different in other areas of the world. And even in the United States, I'd probably say that there are times and around certain issues like the policing issue right now, where that social contract has been broken or has become frayed for a variety of reasons. And quite honestly, I think that we're not going to necessarily be able to implore governments or talk with them about the importance of doing this. What we do need to do is take a step back and say, how can we support governments in beginning to work on that trust? What are the small things that they can do? What are the services they can provide? What can they do to get citizens involved in the process of governing to begin to build that trust? And every country's in a different stage of this. Some countries will have trust in certain areas and not trust in other areas. But I think in the end, we need to support the processes in those countries. We need to allow the citizens of the countries and the governments to lead the discussions. But what we can do is help support those discussions, help support governments to build their own capacity to engage communities in helping provide guidance to the government, being able to support governments in beginning to provide certain services that they haven't in the past, so that citizens can begin to trust in the government's ability to provide services, for example. Those are the kind of things that might make a difference in the long run. And other people might have a different view of that, but that's coming from a development perspective. I do think that that's really critical.
Let's pull the thread on that to really get some details on that. Could you talk a little bit more about how USAID operates? Because I think that I remember there was a big story during not the mass migration during the previous Trump administration, but in the Obama administration. And a lot of that USAID was trying very hard to build programs in Central America that would support agriculturists, farmers who were trying to grow crops in conjunction with coffee in areas to support their livelihoods. When those programs came to a screeching halt, when we moved into the Trump administration, that was the start of a lot of the mass migration north from a lot of those villages in the highlands. So perhaps giving us more substance. What does USAID do? What does USIP do to do that support role?
Yeah, well, I can't necessarily talk about the specifics of the USAID programs in Latin America, since that's not the region that I was involved in, but I can talk a little bit about what USAID does in these countries and what USIP can do as well. Mm-hmm. USAID partners with countries all around the world to help support development. And what that means is that USAID sets aside the US government in general sets aside a certain amount of money to develop programs in a given country. Those programs can be around agriculture, water, and so on. Let's use agriculture since you brought up agriculture. What USAID will do is sit down with country officials, with village leaders, with the private sector, and say, what are the biggest challenges here? Why is it that agricultural systems are not producing enough food, or that parts of the country are producing enough food, but it's not being shared or moved to places where people want to buy it? Or why are countries not, for example, exporters of agricultural products to countries that would be interested in buying them? What about these systems are facing challenges? Oftentimes we think that they're technological challenges. The soil is poor, we can provide nutrients to the soil, markets don't work, we can figure out how to build roads and help people build up skills to build small businesses, for example, to make markets work better. And USAID works on a lot of those issues, from a very, very small scale up to very significant policy issues. And sometimes it's about introducing new farming techniques. Sometimes it's about helping farmers access finance so that they can plan in advance and purchase products or better seeds that will help them get more product out of their land and earn more income for their families. But it can also be about real policy issues at the national level. So USIP specializes in a particular part of that. USIP works on the governance and conflict issues. So when for example, communities that are hurting communities are beginning to fight over land with communities that are farming communities, for example, how do you bring those two communities together to talk about why they are in conflict and what it is that's driving that conflict and how they could solve those problems? for example. So USIP is able to step in and help communities build the skills they need to address those kinds of problems. USAID does some of that work as well, but USAID is split over so many different sectors, and oftentimes it tries to build conflict conflict skills, like how you actually discuss these issues and work on these problems together, into its programs. But in a way, USIP specializes in that to a degree that USAID can't necessarily specialize. And so USIP has been able to develop approaches, develop training materials, really develop the next generation of peace builders in so many ways, because it is specialized in addressing those kinds of skill sets. Megan, I'm wondering whether it would make sense for you to say more about what USIP does. I hope you don't mind if I invite Megan to add to that.
No, please.
Sure, Tegan, that is an excellent example. USIP works, as you say, closely at that community level to build relationships between groups of people who are in conflict in countries around the world, giving them the skills they need. You probably know conflict management skills like negotiation and mediation, but they also work at that top level, which I think you referred to, Tegan, around working with governments, especially around issues of fragility or climate security. So helping improve governing structures so that governments can provide the services that they need that will help prevent conflict and that people can trust in their governments. So we work at both those levels. We say we work top down, so working with leaders in countries, and bottom up, working with the communities that may be in conflict with each other to bring them together to rebuild those relationships. Using, as you say, Tegan, lots of these good conflict management skills and approaches that you develop it in this field. So yes, it comes from both directions.
Excellent, thank you. Emma, did we address your question? Excellent, glad. So I'm gonna move on specifically to the migration issue. And Emma, please feel free to put more questions in the chat box and I will address those as soon as I see them. But on the migration issue, we are seeing migration from Central America into the United States. We're seeing migration out of the Sahel and regions in the Middle East into Europe. We're seeing, of course, we're seeing migration in areas in South Asia that are plagued by, various climatic events. So as you look around the world at all these mass migration issues that are happening, how do you know whether those are substantially influenced by climate factors, and how much of them are just, poor governance, war, various other things? How do you do that analysis to understand how climate change itself is driving people to leave their homes and seek a better life elsewhere?
That's a very good question and a very relevant one, because we're still trying to figure that out. Though, we talked a bit the first time that you and I spoke about how people don't necessarily make the decision to move because of climate change. And so it's really hard to piece apart what percentage of their decision is due to climate change or what percentage of the migration is due to climate change. And so at this stage, I think one of the most helpful things is to take a step back and basically try to understand all the different risks in a system and basically do a diagnosis of the system and say, what are the different risks? Are they strong risks? Are they weak risks? Are they strong here, weak here? And then how do they intersect? because it's rare that people will say that they're moving due to climate change. And then the other thing is migration is an adaptation, and it's something that people have been doing for generations, moving to seek a better life elsewhere. And so it is, in a sense, something, there is not just a negative aspect of migration, but a positive one, in that individuals and communities have moved over thousands of years seeking out different kinds of lives for themselves, or different kinds of survival techniques and so on. And so migration is not necessarily a negative. There are really positive and adaptive aspects of migration. But I think there is an increasing assumption that it's better for people to stay where they are, that they prefer to stay where they are rather than being forced to move. And I would agree, being forced out of a place is not the best thing. Moving because you are being drawn to a place is probably preferable than being forced out. But we at least are beginning to think about where are the areas where the risks are likely to be greatest. And what we're trying to do is look at climate change impacts in different areas of the world and how those intersect with governance or fragility challenges. So for example, sea level rise is affecting some of the major coastal cities, especially in Southeast Asia, or in places in West Africa. And so from a scientific standpoint, we can say, there's likely to be an intersection of sea level rise, an intersection of increased flooding in these cities. Certain cities might be better positioned to address those problems than other cities. So in the United States, for example, Miami, which sits right along the ocean, is already investing in infrastructure and moving roads back from the coast, for example, or increasing the height of roads and buildings. So Miami is probably not as at risk as other areas of the world. And so we can look at how those factors begin to add up. Are there environment or climate risks factors? Are there social and economic factors or political factors? Where we're seeing a lot of risks begin to add up, that's probably where we need to pay attention. Where environment and climate risks are weaker, but there are stronger risks in other areas, maybe those of us in the environmental arena don't need to pay as much attention, but those are still critical areas for other reasons. And so what I personally am moving to is thinking about climate and environment issues as another risk factor among a variety of risk factors. And then trying to really understand how climate and environment issues are intersecting with those other risk factors to really create very fragile situations.
That's great. That's an excellent explanation of that. And I think what we're seeing is the need to prioritize. So, we as the US government, or we as US citizens who part of the government, recognize that there's investments, you have to make choices. We're dealing with, like, as you mentioned, sea level rise in Miami, and we're dealing with sea level rise in Bangladesh. How do you think about prioritizing those investments from the US government perspective to enhance our own security, hence the security of particular regions, and then enhance US national security?
That's a very complicated question. And, I'm not up to date on how US government people are really thinking this through. What I can tell you a little bit is how I'm beginning to think it through, which is a very
That's all I'm
individual
asking.
answer. Yeah. I think that there are a couple of different ways that we can think about security. One is how climate environment issues might cause disasters and therefore a demand on the United States to provide aid. And then another issue is how those climate and environment issues, even overseas, might directly impact the United States. So there's the question of whether, climate and environment issues is causing migration or is causing, something to come to the fore that really requires US intervention because it's more of a humanitarian thing versus something that threatens us directly, threatens our borders directly, and so on. And I am probably better positioned to look at that demand for humanitarian assistance and development assistance better than the threat directly on our borders, or directly to the US country or to the US kind of land, if I can call it that. That prioritization is really tough. When I was at USAID, basically, when I was beginning to think about how we designed a climate change and international development kind of investment portfolio in Africa, I tried to do an assessment of where climate change risks were the greatest, and also what were the governance issues that were going to be a big challenge, and looked at places where governance was weak, where climate risks were large, and said, okay, should we prioritize that over all else? At USIP, well, number one, we learned a lot over the years about what worked and what didn't from a development perspective. But then also at USIP, where we are really focused more on peace building than anything else, there's an additional component of that, which is about how, apologies, I have a visitor who is going to want to start her schoolwork. Apologies to all the students out there who hopefully have younger siblings trying to figure out, schoolwork from home as well.
We get it.
Shut the door, please. Thank you so much, kiddo. At USIP, we're really focused on that conflict angle. And so it's almost like we're narrowing down to a certain thing, whereas at USIP, USAID, I had a much wider breadth of issues around governance and so on that we were dealing with. At this stage, I'm still trying to take an environment or a climate science lens to this and say, what are the geographies that are popping up to me from a climate perspective, but then layering onto that some of our understanding about how what drives conflict beyond environment issues, and trying to use that as a way to narrow down. And it's tough because I think as we try to do this, we still need to develop our thinking in this area. Climate change is not something that we have a ton of experience in addressing. And the intersection between climate change and conflict, or climate change and fragility, is still an exceedingly new field. And so we're still trying to develop ways to think about that and ways to prioritize. So I don't have a good answer, but what I can say is that I am trying to bring in kind of our understanding of what drives fragility and provide an environment or climate lens on that as well.
That's really helpful, Dr. Blaine. That's really helpful. What you did just do is tell Emma and the other students that we need the next generation working on these problems.
Yes.
So, Megan, I'm going to ask you to add some information of that, and I'm going to ask Emma to think about additional questions that she may have while you're talking, Megan. Thank you.
Sure. Gosh, Dr. Blaine, this has been so inspiring, and there's so much that I didn't know, and this is great. And I imagine you're also getting the juices flowing for the students who are watching and thinking about ways to stay engaged on this and wanting to learn more. And so I want to encourage all those students watching to check out more that the U.S. Institute of Peace has to offer. There's a lot of ways you can work with us and stay engaged with us and learn from us. If you go to USIP's website, you'll see a whole section on education and training. And within that section, there's resources for students. So you can find information on contests that we sponsor. You can find information on ways to start peace clubs, if this is something that's really grabbing you. You can find access to USIP's free online courses, like we have micro courses that are 3 hours long, where you can get really into some of these topics and these skills, and they're all free. There are great events that we host and put on our website. So there's great articles. You can go read a ton more that Dr. Blaine has written if you really want to get into this, and read more from the U.S. Institute of Peace if you're doing research on particular conflicts or on peace building solutions around the world. There's a lot of ways you can learn from our website, and we're here as a resource. So I'm always happy, and I can drop my email in the chat box too. I can be your connector to anything USIP. So if you wanted to follow up with an expert to have a conversation, or wanted to just learn more and be directed somewhere, I'm happy to be the conductor, so I can send you in that direction. So there are lots of ways that I hope you'll stay engaged. Maureen, is that what you hoped I would talk about?
Yes, that's great. That's great, Megan.
Okay.
And please do put the website link and your
Great.
contact information. That's great. Emma, do you have, okay, we have a question from our other student, Randy. Of the 20 countries deemed most vulnerable to climate change, 12 are mired in conflict, according to the recent Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative Index. Is it the responsibility of the governments of the G8, the global economic leaders, to help resolve the conflict in these countries like Yemen and Mali and Afghanistan and various other places? Is it, whose responsibility is it to help address this? And then how do we think about, the US's role in those situations, so that we aren't spread so thin we're not able to deal with the things at home, I guess is the short answer, your short question. So Dr. Blaine.
Randy, you and Emma don't ask easy questions. And I'm really excited to see such challenging questions, because, wow, I'm looking forward to seeing everybody's, both your leadership and Emma's leadership, as you move through school and really into your eventual careers, because we need, if you guys are asking these questions now, I just can't even imagine.
Randy's cheating because she's with NSF, but she's a lifelong student.
But I'm still a student learning about climate change, so I'm fascinated by this.
Sorry, I hadn't realized you were the same person I met earlier, but yeah, these are just such great questions. I think one of the challenges here is that it is not clearly anybody's responsibility, and it's not clearly not anybody's responsibility. And as, kind of a global community, we really need to figure out how we engage in these conversations together. There is a degree of well, it's a critical issue in the UN discussions around climate change, about the historical role that the United States, for example, has played in emitting the greenhouse gases that cause climate change, and what that means for the responsibility of the United States and countries like, European countries, Japan, and so on, which have the historical kind of the 100 years of generating global emissions that are really leading to climate change now. But that's a hard one to pin down in terms of responsibility, that historical responsibility. Yes, there is a degree of historical responsibility. How does that translate, and what does that actually mean? And how do we support countries that are nominally independent and make their own choices about their pathway? You know, there's a question as well about what is the role of economic leaders, not just the G8, but a wider community of leaders as well, who theoretically have the ability to share some of their wealth to support other countries. And there just are no easy answers. I mean, people assign responsibilities in different places. I do think that there are roles that countries can play, especially because of pre-existing relationships, where there's already trust between two countries. And so if one of those countries is able to support the other, then why wouldn't they do that as kind of a trust building exercise between those countries too? But that whole issue about responsibility is just, it's an evolving, we have an evolving responsibility, or we have an evolving idea about what the responsibility of individual countries is. And every country comes at this with a different approach. And so it's really difficult to say, do we have a global understanding of that responsibility? Mm-hmm. No, not at this stage.
Well, and the challenge too is, how does the American government or the Chinese government or the Japanese government convince their citizenry that they should care about cows starving in Yemen, or floods in Afghanistan, or like right now in Nicaragua. And now we're seeing the immigration flow into America. And a lot of that is from climate changes down in the Southern Hemisphere. So how do you get, and I know it's more of a rhetorical question, but how do we get our own citizens to recognize the importance of us reducing our carbon footprint has a global impact, and how we care? Why should we care when we're not seeing it directly? We're not impacted. And I think Americans are just so self-absorbed to begin with that it makes it even a harder thing for Americans specifically to do. But I just was thinking, this is a big responsibility, and there is no world court that says you stop doing this, you stop doing that.
No, and we're seeing kind of some of the same decisions when it comes to COVID as well, and questions about the responsibility of countries that developed vaccines in terms of sharing those vaccines or helping produce those vaccines in other countries. And so these issues are not unique to the climate change arena. They are kind of much wider, much more cross-cutting issues. And I mean, I do think that there is something to be said that because the United States is such a large country and many people are not regularly crossing our borders, that we do tend to be a bit more internally focused than other smaller countries where people are more exposed to different governments and what's going on in those different countries. But at the same time, this learning to care about communities and invest communities is as important at the local level as it is at the global level. And thinking about how we work together as the United States, as 50 states, plus a few additional, whether it's Puerto Rico or whether it's the District of Columbia or other places that are still part of the United States without being a state in their own right, how we all come together on those shared issues, even within the United States, is also very parallel to how we come together as a global community. And so there's work to be done at every level, from the local all the way up to the global. I don't know what the answer is.
No, I think you touched on something really important, you and Megan both. Working from the bottom up is really important. And Randy, you said that earlier. How do you convince people? You start with doing things like we're doing today. We're reaching out to students and and students reach out to their networks and they go off and study things. And I mean, we sort of have to build from the bottom up. Emma, would you let us know, are you a senior and are you headed off to university? Yes,
Congratulations.
wonderful. You're going to UNR. Terrific. We're thrilled to hear that. I'm on the physics faculty at UNR, and you're studying political science. Fantastic.
Cool.
We may come back
no,
and talk to you.
run away, Emma,
No,
don't
no,
do
no,
that.
No.
I'm a lobbyist.
We'll need her.
I've
with
run
the
for
National
office.
Security Forum. So there may be great opportunities with the National Security Forum. We're looking to establish an internship partnership between the School of Political Science at UNR and National Security Forum. So we will be in touch. As we close out right now, we've got just 2 minutes left. I'd like both of you, so Megan, I'm going to start with you. Parting words for students who are thinking about being engaged in peace building in the future. What is your advice to them? And then I'll turn it over for the last word to Dr. Blaine.
You know, I'm so struck by this conversation and how it is a balance between talking about conflict and the challenges we face while also talking about the hope and the capacity we have to affect that change. And I know probably a lot of young people are really interested in climate change and maybe are even involved in activities around climate change. And I would just encourage you to seek out those stories of people who are doing something about it. I mean, USIP offers a lot of great stories about the peace builders, those communities around the world that are overcoming these challenges and finding really creative ways to meet them and resolve these conflicts. Because it can also really overwhelming at times. This is a huge issue that the whole world is facing and no one has figured out how to do it quite yet. But I encourage us all to seek out those good stories, those people who are making a difference, Dr. Blaine included, to really latch on to and think about how you right now can also get involved in this. So, you know, it's great to think about this as a professional field and a course of study, but as a young person, these are all issues, of course, that you can be engaged on right now, and you have a voice and you can make it heard and you can be making a difference. And finding those who are making a difference already and thinking about ways to support them or elevate their voices is also really important. So there is so much reason for hope around this, but we have to be really proactive in finding it. And maybe I'll just on that and turn it over to Dr. Blaine.
Fantastic.
You already covered a couple of my points, but I guess what I would say is go forth with courage and that everybody can change the world. I have been really struck over the last few years how the youth community has influenced the discussion around climate change. And I think that the youth community can have as much impact in the peace building area. And so I would just encourage you not to wait until you're mid-career, but to actually, if you are ready to move on these issues, do it now, do it early, do it in a committed way. And you know, this is just a little thing that we used to say in my Peace Corps days. Little steps. It takes little steps to get to your goal, and maybe a lot of little steps, but just think of it in terms of little steps, little steps, little steps, and eventually you make huge progress with those little steps. And, you know, 20, 25 years out of Peace Corps, I still think about that and remember every day is just another step. And I try to keep the big picture in mind. And so I hope all of you will do that as you begin your careers as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Blaine. Thank you, Megan, for joining us. Emma, I dropped my NSF email in, so if you and any of your other students are interested in the possibility of future internships with NSF from UNR, please let me know. We will be working with the UNR faculty actually next week. I have a coordination call with them. So with that, thank you both very much. And thank you to the U.S. Institute of Peace for all that you are doing. in this field. We look forward to working with you again. And as a fellow climate scientist, Dr. Blaine, thank you for taking the time to give us a very fascinating perspective on the problems we have ahead and some of the areas that our students can pursue in the future. So with that, have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you all so much.